You are listening to the podcast of the Mátyás Corvinus Collegium, the largest talent management institute in Hungary. If you want to know more about our mission, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or check out our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter channels. For interesting articles and analysis of our professors, external contributors, and students, look up our knowledge base at Corvinak.hu/en.
In today's episode on MCC Podcast, I'm very honored to welcome Professor Péter Deneen, Professor of Political Science at the University of Notre Dame. Thank you very much, Professor Deneen, to be here with us.
It's really great to be with you. Thank you.
Just a few sentences about you. To start off, you are an author of more books, mainly on political theory and democracy, including Why Liberalism Failed, came out 3 years ago and has been translated to more than 15 languages, I
believe so, yes.
Or even more. Before we dive into this topic and analyzing the current state of liberalism and their political reality, tell us what brought you to Budapest and why did you decide to accept MCC's invitation?
Well, so first, thank you for having me here. It's great to be in person and not wearing a mask in the same room. And I'm very much enjoying these days in Hungary. I was made aware of MCC's interest in hosting intellectuals, international scholars interested in the kinds of questions that we're discussing today. And looking at my calendar at the end of our academic year and before we get into a new academic year, this seemed like a good time to come over. I think it was actually rather coincidental, in fact, that I was here while Rod Dreher was here and that an event was scheduled. So it was just really kind of a bit of happenstance that I happened to be here, but I'm very glad for it. Rod is a friend, and it was actually kind of very nice to be able to spend time with him and some new friends here. So it's just, I think in some ways it's for me, represents a kind of reopening of my life after a year of sitting at home. So I'm very glad to be here.
I found a great video recently on YouTube you made for Reset DOC when you said about the program of liberalism, that is to transform the world by teaching people the ability to liberate themselves from other people and ultimately from nature. And when I listened to this sentence, it sounded to me like more of another utopian ideology. Many similar we already threw out in the bin of history. So the promise of, eternal happiness and progress. We have heard it in the 20th century like enough, and liberation on earth. Liberalism didn't start off like this, or did it?
Well, it's interesting. I think I actually began my book talking about the three ideologies of the 20th century. Liberalism is the earliest of these, and then you have communism and fascism. And the three, in many ways, you could say they were, deeply opposed to each other, ended up fighting each other at different times. And liberalism was triumphant, at least in 1989, with the fall of the Soviet Union having defeated fascism in Europe and in the East. And it seemed that liberalism was triumphant in significant part because it was a more realistic belief system. It was a more realistic understanding of politics. Its basis was the understanding of human beings as, in some ways, not perfectible. That was its origin, was in the political philosophy of, I think a proto-liberal like Thomas Hobbes, a full liberal like John Locke. The idea of the human being as self-interested, as seeking their material interests, and hence having a relationship and view toward nature as one of needing to master or conquer nature. So in some ways you could say it begins, this is an argument that you find, for example, in the political philosopher Leo Strauss, who really sees the origins of liberalism in kind of an older tradition you can trace back to Machiavelli, who wants to place politics on what Strauss described as the low but solid ground of self-interest, of human self-interest. In this respect, it seemed, certainly from the perspective of 1989, as a kind of an anti-ideology, that liberalism was not ideological, that in fact it resisted ideology. It resisted a vision of politics that could be transformational or seek the perfection of human being. But the argument in my book is that actually it always contained a kind of ideological kernel that was not as evident to us, in particular because we were comparing it to far more obvious utopian projects of fascism with its effort to sort of create a purified race, or with communism in the kind of Marxist version of a utopian society of self-overcoming. What I think you see in the kernel of liberalism is a kind of Promethean project in which our ability to make ourselves, our ability to free ourselves from the limitations, first of all, of other people, the relationships or bonds or the sort of accidents of birth, who you happen to be born to, where you happen to be born to, the tradition you happen to be born in, all of these things that, I think in an earlier time would have been seen as constitutive of who we are. They make us who we are, where you're from, the tradition you're from, the religion you're born into, come to be seen as accidents. Right, just purely accidental, purely happenstance. The kernel of, you could say the Promethean kernel of liberalism is this vision of human freedom that can be attained and achieved once we have freed ourselves of all of these sort of accidents of birth and circumstance and time and place, which in the first instance calls for a political transformation and then eventually, of course, a technological, scientific transformation. The view of nature as fundamentally subject to our command and dominion. Now, today we're aware of the dangers of this project, certainly in the technological sphere when we think of things like climate change and global warming. But what we also see is a new and deep form of this transformational ambition in the kind of, we could say, the way it's especially been oriented into the sexual transformation, or the biological transformation of human beings, taking command of our own nature. This is the sort of where this Promethean ambition has gone. So all this is to say that I think liberalism actually from the very start was in fact an ideological project to remake human beings. It just was not as visible to us, given the context in which it arose and given the context in which, particularly in the 20th century, it was posed against its ideological competitors. But now, in the aftermath of 1989, its own ideological project has become fully visible to us in ways that I think are just obvious. If you just, to quote my friend Sohrab Ahmari, just look around and you can see this transformational project taking place.
I think it's very interesting, this comparison with communism or fascism, because, the word or the term liberal just somehow developed differently. I mean, for instance, in Hungary, when I think of the term liberal, if you go back to the 19th century, for instance, and you see the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, the history and the prosperity of the monarchy, here or history books, for instance, mention, as a liberal place, that equals to prosperity, social progress, and peace, and long-term prosperity in this sense. So I was wondering, because you've just said that maybe after 89 we started seeing the real face of liberalism. When you compare to communism or fascism, you cannot see any good examples of that systems where they actually existed in its fullest form or in any form, and you can say that, okay, and this was successful. In liberalism, when you open the history books, you find many examples that relate success to a sort of liberal order.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can open up older books than even histories of the Habsburgs, which would include Aristotle and Cicero, Plato, Aquinas, and so forth, to find a recommendation of liberality or the virtues of the liberal human being. In fact, Aristotle names liberality, or a Greek version of that word, as one of the key virtues. It means a kind of generosity, the capacity to be hospitable, a certain openness, and It's a very ancient word. And of course, the word liberty itself has its roots in ancient Rome. Libertas, the word that means freedom. In particular, the freedom of the person who is not a slave or a subject, the freedom of a citizen. The word liberal is also very early attached to the ideal of education in antiquity. Liberal education is the education of a free person. So it's a very ancient word. And I think what we need to understand in light of what I was just saying is when we talk about liberalism in the way in which I described it, and I think in its current meaning, we're seeing a very ancient word and a very ancient concept that was colonized by a new set of ideas, that it was effectively redefined in the period of time that we were just talking about, sort of early modernity broadly. And that's where you really begin to see this, and you can locate this kernel of this more ideological, modernist, transformational project. So I think in some senses you're correct that we have older understandings of this word of liberal that we might say have significant resources for us from the stance of where we are today. But perhaps we would want to avoid conflating this older understanding of the word liberal with the way in which we tend to understand that word today. It's worth mentioning, this is true, of course, of the word, not the word communism, but the root of the word of communism, which is community or communitas in Latin, which also has a great, deep and profound tradition that really ultimately, you can see some resemblances with what Marx develops in the Communist Manifesto or in his other writings about communism. But it's, of course, a very different understanding. So I think a lot of modern political philosophy represents a kind of intellectual colonization of very old words and very old concepts, but turning them in a kind of ideological direction. So here, I guess I would want to say that we can turn to either pre-modern texts and pre-modern intellectual traditions, not necessarily to search for a kind of a continuity of this concept and to say it's exactly the same thing, but almost as kind of correctives to the way that these terms have been redefined, not as a nostalgic trip to say we need to restore this, but to remind ourselves, among other things, that a kind of colonization of language, or let's say a transformation of language and concepts, is itself a kind of example of what might be available to us today. I'm often asked, well, if you're against liberalism, are you anti-liberal? And the first thing I'll respond to that is, no, I'm actually in favor of liberty, but it needs to be rightly defined. So it's not posing liberty against liberty. It's actually posing liberty and liberty, right? Liberty as understood in modern times and liberty in an older understanding. And I think that should really be the aim, is to, in some ways, reappropriate and redefine and recolonize in some ways, or define anew in light of our contemporary circumstances what is actually a very old, noble, and it seems to me a promising set of concepts.
By what means do you think it's possible?
Well, I think
I'm not necessarily talking about popular culture, just in general.
Well, I think human society is a kind of organic, developing entity, and just to assume that we've reached a point. It's almost a kind of Fukuyama position. We've reached a point where it's the end of history, and no further development is possible. And this was, in some ways, Fukuyama's argument in 1989 that we'd reached the end of history, that we'd solved the problem of regimes and political order. This seems to me, to be proven, to have been proven wrong in the last 20, 30 years or so since 1989. I think this is the project of, it's a project of many hands, but those many hands include teachers, philosophers, political thinkers, political actors, journalists, media people. I mean, this is the kind of project I would say that, at the very beginnings of the liberal project, this was what people set out to do. And I would say they were quite successful. But this does not represent simply the final, denouement and definition of where we have to stay. So I think first of all we have to diagnose where we are, how we've gotten here, and then we begin to devise and begin to think about ways of moving forward from here.
Well, I can propose a diagnosis in the form of a question, because you obviously quote many times Tocqueville in your book, and in one place you quote him that he argues that the practices of democratic citizenship in America and its roots originate from the wider and general understanding of Christian liberty, meaning that it aims more at doing what is just and good, rather than the nowadays popular act as you wish, so as long as no one is physically harmed or in general harmed. Do you think that liberalism also seems to fail in this sense, because its followers eliminated all the classical and Christian ideas from it, and by this made it captive to contemporary and radical ideologies? We have already touched upon it, I think, in a sense. And do you think it's a correct diagnosis?
Yeah, I think this quote from Tocqueville occurs early in his great book, Democracy in America, which should be read in Hungary and everywhere. It's a great diagnosis simply of democracy in modernity, we could rightly call it. That in that passage, he's speaking of the founding of democracy in America. And he recognizes that, and he asserts that democracy in America thrives at the time that he saw it in the 1820s, 1830s, was particularly vibrant in the local communities that he visited in my home region of New England. It was particularly successful because it had been founded on a Christian idea of liberty. And he actually quotes from a Puritan thinker, Cotton Mather, who defines liberty in that passage that's quoted by Tocqueville, defines liberty as a kind of form of self-command and self-discipline and self-governance, and says this understanding of liberty, that one achieves liberty when one has achieved, in a sense, discipline over the disordered parts of one's nature, the appetites, the passions. This is the classical definition of liberty, that freedom is not just doing as you want. Freedom is when you have disciplined and achieved a kind of self-command over the more undisciplined parts of our nature. Right? So we know this, right? We know that you shouldn't just eat whatever you want just because it tastes good. This is a form of self-discipline. But the older understanding understood this was a comprehensive undertaking and that it was difficult. It's difficult to achieve this self-discipline and self-command. So it couldn't just be a sort of individual self-help project like we tend to think of it today. It actually needed the support of social institutions and broadly a kind of culture that cultivated these capacities for self-discipline. And of course, it had a political dimension, and this is what Tocqueville's mentioning, that democracy, as he saw it, and as he praised it, was the literal practice of self-discipline in a community, that people learn how to rule themselves, to govern themselves, to place laws over themselves. So he appeals to the old Aristotelian understanding of citizenship. Citizenship is, as Aristotle defines it, is ruling and being ruled in turn. It's the ability to place limits upon oneself as a people, and then to submit oneself to the laws that one has made. That's literally the definition of rule of law, right? Is to set out the forms by which we govern ourselves. This is what Tocqueville praises as the excellence that lies behind American democracy in the 19th century. And you're right that what we have over the course of some 100 years, 200 years now, we have fundamentally changed that definition to its opposite. What Tocqueville or the classical thinkers would have understood as the absence of liberty, which is allowing the baser or the undisciplined parts of our nature to have full reign, becomes our definition of liberty. It becomes the definition of democracy today. So the consequences of this redefinition, I think, are considerable. And I talk about these a bit in my book. The first is that rather than resulting in a condition of true and genuine freedom, it actually requires the rise of an increasingly authoritative state that acts in some ways as the externalized version of discipline, if I could put it that way. This is a very Foucaultian point. Foucault can be very useful if we read him in the right ways. Actually, he has very interesting Tocquevillian moments, that if we do not learn self-government as a shared enterprise, it will be imposed on us because we are disordered. A disordered society will become more centralized, more top-down, and it will be experienced in a form in which is increasingly acts in a kind of potentially more tyrannical way, because we now externalized any need for self-command. But there's another consequence that seems to me to be significant that I think really does help us understand our current moment. The definition that you just mentioned of freedom and of democracy as the ability to do as one wishes unless one harms someone else, right, sets the conditions for which the exercise of public power, public authority can be used. This is Mill's argument in his book on liberty. If I harm you, the state can intervene. If I don't harm you, then the state has no business interacting with us, interfering in our activities as individuals. There was always a kind of, now this seemed to be a kind of, a liberating philosophy that, you couldn't be paternalistic anymore. You couldn't tell someone how they should live their lives. But if we really understand the kind of deeper dynamics of Mill's argument, it's always going to depend on how we define harm. It's always going to depend what constitutes harm. And today, of course, what we have done is we've sort of psychologized and made kind of therapeutic the idea of harm. Right? This is the old argument, the Rise of the Therapeutic Self by Philip Reif, that the therapeutic self wants to be free of harm, which means to be free of judgment, be free of the judgment of others, to be free of criticism of others, to be free of anyone expressing what they think might diverge from what you hold to be is the best way of your life. So today what we see happening is that those who are most likely to assert that they are being harmed, we see that especially in universities today, we see these in all kinds of social contexts in which the invocation of harm now is a kind of felt, subjective form of psychological harm, the kind of therapeutic form of harm, in which now increasingly the power of the state, as well as the power of sort of the civil society, institutions, corporations, NGOs, and so forth, now is being levied against people who are deemed to be judgmental, who are deemed to be acting in a harmful way. People need to be protected from the judgment of others. And so we have this kind of odd situation now today in which the invocation of harm is now used precisely in a kind of paternalistic way to enforce the views of those who hold this idea of this radical idea of freedom against those who, in the old Tocquevillian sense, hold an idea of freedom that understands freedom in a form of kind of self-discipline and self-command. So in other words, it's not that we have been completely freed from authority at some level, which was at least maybe the belief of Mill, but that authority now is used to exercise a kind of form of state as well as social control over those who have a more traditional idea of what liberty is.
Or if I may add, or even those groups who want to be free of judgment, they want to be free of control and also exercise control on the other groups that they see, somehow dangerous to their freedoms. So it's somehow.
Yeah, I think I think at some level this is true. But what we now see is that it's not even a matter of a sort of fear or concern of control. It's at least in the United States today, there's no. There's little plausible argument or claim to be made that those Christians are about to form a theocratic state and deem homosexuality to be illegal or something. It's really that if you hold a view that's judgmental against my activities, my freed autonomous activities, you must be reprimanded, either to be sanctioned in your job, sanctioned socially. What we call the cancel culture now really reflects this. So it's not even, it's invoked out of the fear of a form of political or social control. But the form in which it manifests today, I think, reveals that at the deepest level, it's about eliminating anyone who holds this alternative understanding of what constitutes liberty.
If I understood you correctly, we're talking about groups, but ultimately we're talking about individual intentions and freedoms not to be harmed. So it's interesting how this modern form of liberalism, with its individualistic component, actually sets the way to more totalitarian forms of power. Because when there is a lack of community and we're only talking about individual interests and individual freedoms, and they claim or they want to build up a state that secure their freedoms, whatever they want to do, it will ultimately lead to a more totalitarian form of the execution of power and not to limit it.
Yeah, so in the first instance, we can say that the way in which liberty is defined in the modern setting necessarily seeks the weakening, if not the elimination, of the kinds of groups or the kinds of organizations and institutions and associations that were deemed and understood to be central to achieving human flourishing by the older understanding of liberty. And this is, again, to go back to Tocqueville. Tocqueville praises, especially in the United States, he praises the vibrancy and health of associational life. He sees associations, right? He notices that in America, when there's a problem, when a community faces an issue, they don't wait for, Washington, D.C. to pass, some piece of legislation. People just get together and they figure out a way to solve the problem. He says, this is amazing. He said, we don't do this in France. He said, but in America, they kind of get together, they form a group. And he goes on to say, people learn how to be citizens in these groups. In other words, citizenship isn't just something you have because you were born into a particular place. Citizenship is a kind of active quality, and it's interactive. And it's done and achieved and developed in the context of these kind of interactions. He has this wonderful line in which he says, through the activity and interaction of associational life, the heart is enlarged. We learn how to encompass more through more people. But this isn't just an abstract call for humanitarianism. It's it has to be a cultivated activity that takes place in concrete human association. It's not learned in a classroom, it's learned in the world with other people. Now notice that, as I was saying earlier, the modern understanding of liberalism finds any arbitrary set of groups, whether it's the community we happen to be born into, the church that we happen to be born into, the religious tradition, the cultural tradition we're born into, finds all these to be limitations on our liberty. We have to be freed from these. So one of the consequences of the modern form of liberty is to weaken and undermine the vibrancy of these kinds of institutions that Tocqueville saw as essential. Right? This becomes the definition of what democracy is, to free the individual. Right? It's the opposite of what Tocqueville argues. So again, the consequence is that once you have sufficiently weakened these groups, which I think is one of the hallmarks of the modern age, right? I mean, every sociological study that I know of basically proves that when it comes to associations, whether it's voluntary groups, churches, communities, so forth, all of them are weakened, right? We're all more alone, right? To use the Putnam phrase, we're all bowling alone now. That once this has happened, then the sort of the self, right, is reduced to this, single point, this kind of atomized point. And it's at this point then that we are supposed to have achieved our freedom, but we become now radically subject to the kinds of external forces of the economy, external forces of, obviously, of increasingly of the state, and in which our actual freedom of citizens has been shrunk, if not altogether eliminated, as Tocqueville would understand it.
I would like to bring in another term, populism. Do you think this as one of the phenomena that demonstrates the revolt against the liberal order and liberal elites? And for this, you see it as something positive or a necessary means to break a so-called bad status quo?
Yeah, I think, as you mentioned, my book came out in 2018, and it was some people would say the sad result, or some people might say the fruit of at least a decade of thinking about these things, probably longer, probably much of my adult life, trying to figure out what I saw as the deepest, kind of unseen dynamics of modern liberalism. It wasn't written as a description of what now has come to be known as the sort of populist movement or the populist outburst across the West. It just so happened to have been timed, perhaps at least for my sales, rather well, that it came out at just about the time of the election of, the passage of Brexit and the election of Donald Trump. And at least for many people seem to explain, or at least seem to explain those things. It wasn't my aim, because I wasn't thinking of that there would be immediate kind of political consequences to the dynamics that I describe. On the other hand, it's not at all surprising to me that these are the consequences. And in fact, one of the last chapters I write, I describe something that I call the new aristocracy. And the new aristocracy, as I describe it, is in some ways it's the subtle argument for a new kind of ruling elite that you see and you can identify already in the writings of John Locke, for example. So when we read someone like Locke, what perhaps is most immediately evident is that it's a critique of the old aristocracy. It's a critique of the old ruling class, right, who held their positions precisely because it's what they were born into. Right? It was a hereditary society. Your position, your status in life was the result of who and where you were born to. And so it was, it wasn't, in this sense, it was a deeply arbitrary set of arrangements that status and rank were the result of birthright. What Locke was seeking to do, as many authors, early liberal authors at this time, was to say we need to overturn this arbitrariness and rather unleash the kind of what we now recognize today, or we would call today meritocracy. Unleash people's native talents and native abilities. Especially, Locke emphasizes, in the economic realm. Are you productive? Can your talents be used to advance the Promethean project of advancing, human comfort, what he calls the indolence of the body, our ability to be comfortable in this world, to see ourselves as mastering this world? The consequence, on the one hand, so the immediate consequence is the displacement of the old aristocracy. Or the old aristocracy just can't stand up against this new dynamic economy and way of organizing ourselves. So the old aristocracy ceases to exist after a period of time. And it takes us a little while to recognize, well, this actually is giving rise to a new ruling class, right? Which we've, have come to recognize as maybe the dominant force in today's society. When we talk about elites today, what we're talking about are those people precisely that, several hundred years ago in 1689, Locke was describing as the desired ruling class of a future society. He couldn't, he wasn't envisioning it would happen immediately. But once successful, you would displace, it wasn't going to be an egalitarian utopia like Marx. It was going to be a society that was going to be radically differentiated between those who were able to succeed in a kind of borderless, increasingly economistic, increasingly dynamic, destabilizing society of economic dislocation, and those who would not do well in that context. And as it turns out, there's a large proportion of every population that doesn't thrive in conditions of economic instability, of globalized economic activity, of the weakening of the social institutions that we were just talking about in our last exchange. In other words, it creates a society of a very small, distinct number of winners and a very large number of losers, both economically and socially. This is the source of the contemporary discontents that we call populism. Right? This is, I think it describes perfectly the conditions. It represents, in an interesting way, a kind of flip side of the discontents that Locke himself was describing in the 1680s. Right? Well, we have these elites who are ruling over us, who we're not thriving. The ordinary people are not thriving. As it turns out, it simply displaced one aristocracy with another kind of a meritocracy, who have created a new set of arrangements that is distinctly not doing well and not creating the conditions in which ordinary people who don't thrive in conditions of this kind of economic and social instability. So I think this, what we're calling populism, is the direct consequence of the victory, the success of liberalism. And hence, again, the paradox of my argument in my book, liberalism has failed because it has succeeded. Right? It doesn't need more liberalism. It doesn't need to correct itself. It's actually doing very well. But the problem is that it's generating this internal kind of deep discontent and division within broadly the polities of the Western world, and increasingly the globe, that it does not have the ability, it seems to me, to solve.
Yeah, but speaking of these elites, or the notion that once you have an era, now the era of liberalism or this kind of elites, it's inevitable to change the elite, or you have to. So what I want to say that when one seeks for like the new era, or how it's going to look like the new elites of these populists, or the others that will mark the coming of a new era. When you look at Silicon Valley, when you look at the global organizations or social media companies, whatever, where the largest concentrations of money are, you don't necessarily see the rise of new elites. Maybe politically there are, but economically I don't see them. So do you think that it's inevitable that in order to change this liberal order, the elite needs to be changed, or it's going to happen in another way? And this question leads us to your next book, actually, which is going to be called After Liberalism, and will be out this fall, I think.
It's neither likely to be called After Liberalism, but maybe.
Okay.
We haven't worked that out entirely with the publisher, and it probably will not be out this fall. It's likely to be out maybe next spring, and at the latest the fall after this fall. It's just a good deal of editing and a little bit of slow work on my part in light of the last difficult semester teaching in the time of COVID. But it is precisely the topic that this next book is focused on, which really it's an effort to kind of revisit and bring up to date what I regard as one of the most important lines of thinking in classical political philosophy, which is precisely this question of the relationship of sort of the many and the few, the populace and the elite. I mean, this is a very, it's not like we are confronting this question for the first time in human history. This is one of the oldest issues. You go back again to Plato or Aristotle, and it's the big burning issue. How do you prevent the elite from sort of trampling the people, and how do you prevent the people from trampling, the potential excellences of the few? I think where we are today is increasingly we are forced to take sides between, or we're asked to take sides between the sort of liberalism of today's elites or the populism of today's people. That's sort of those are the political options on the table. And it seems to me by revisiting this older tradition, what we see is that this was what they hoped wouldn't happen. They didn't want this to be the choice. Rather, what they wanted was what they recognized was that there were sort of, you could say, kind of inherent virtues and vices of both of these parties in sort of every political regime. In every political regime, the many are likely to have a whole lot of potential vices. And those are the ones that are highlighted by today's elites, right there. They tend to be demagogic. They tend to be more parochial. They want to just defend their traditions. They tend not to be highly educated. It's all, you just have to read like The Economist or something, and you'll come across all these arguments. Or alternatively, you have those who argue that the elites are corrupt, right? That the elites are are ruling the world in this kind of soft totalitarian way, that they dominate using their wealth, position, and status over the interests of the people, that they're likely to be negligent when it comes to the common good. They'll serve their own good, and they're well positioned to do so. And in fact, I find a lot of these arguments on both sides to be true. And so I find myself, in reading these classical authors, to sort of say a kind of a pox on both your houses, that both of these positions have, they have some merit, the critiques have some merit. But what the classical authors also teach us is that there are sort of inherent virtues to each of these parties. And these virtues are most likely to come about when there is sufficient ability of the other side to force the opposite party to correct itself. Right. So in one of the chapters, I use the phrase or the term aristopopulism to describe what I'm trying to get at here. And it's an older concept of the idea of mixed constitution in a much more Aristotelian sense, which is that the many, the people, are likely, for all of the potential vices they might have, they probably also have certain virtues of being sort of close to reality, right? Working with the stuff of reality, familiar with the limitations that the world presents. They are likely to be the bearers of tradition and culture. They are much more likely to develop a kind of bottom-up form of organizing life that doesn't require a kind of top-down imposition of something that's regarded as an external force. They are likely to have, at least in a good society, certain kinds of virtues that we would regard as sort of homely virtues of hard work, of discipline, of patriotism, of care of place. I think care of place is really important, especially in an age of climate change. Like, they're going to care about. They believe in the continuity of the generations, and they want to create places in which their children and their children's children can flourish. On the other hand, of course, the elites have certain virtues which arise from their, again, the very thing that we were talking about as the potential source of their vices. They have status, position, and education, more wealth. So they can develop, through their leisure, they can develop culture, high culture, certain kinds of excellences. They are in a much better position to be the educators of society, the stewards of society, to guide, lead, to give the kind of that they've got this positive responsibility. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, they set a tenor for society, a kind of tone. And what I end up calling for at the end of this book is to say what we really need today is for both sides to make each other better, and it creates a chicken and egg problem, right? But my argument is that in order to do this, we actually are going to probably, what we need to do is have the political power of the many displace the elites that we have today to a considerable extent, and give rise to, I would like to see, a very different kind of elite that aims to do exactly the things that I was just describing. And and the story of, we could say much of the story of humanity follows this line, which is that it has to be a kind of confluence of popular as well as elite interests that leads to a kind of fundamental change of society. It's never been just a revolution from the bottom up, Marxism notwithstanding, that those revolutions were led by elites, right? And they were developed by elites, Marx, Engels, Lenin, et cetera. I think we're in a new time of a very different dynamic, and I think, and I hope, that could give rise to a better political regime, but it requires a new way of rethinking the relationship of the many and the few.
Well, whatever the title would be, we would be happy to have you again here in MCC Podcast once the new book is out as well. Professor Deneen, thank you very much for taking the time and be here with us on MCC Podcast.
It was really a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this MCC Podcast episode. For further media content, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you want to read more by our professors, external contributors, and students, check out our knowledge base at Corvinak.hu/en.